And broadly, we featured it in conversations with Greg and his team, knowing that many of you are working on rather different problems, to tell you a little bit about the specifics that Sarah's going to tell you about, and then a little bit about some of the conclusions we draw about, when new ideas hit large existing systems, if I could put it that way. So just to give, and I know that some of you are not, from the U.S., and we, of course, in the U.S. tend to make this mistake of assuming that, we're very U.S.-centric. It's a weakness. So I want to give just a little bit of background about CORE and what this work is about. CORE is a voluntary collaborative of actually 10 school districts, 7 of whom are participating directly in the work I'm about to describe. And they've come together under this rubric, California Office to Reform Education, C-O-R-E, CORE. And they did it in part to learn and to get peer work going on, and in part because California, the state that they're part of, has struggled to be able to take advantage of some of the opportunities the federal government has served up in recent years because of unwillingness to sign on to a few of the specific demands that the current administration is making around, for example, teacher evaluation. And these districts wanted to be able to participate even if their whole state didn't. And so they kind of challenged the federalism structure we have here and said, well, why can't, we're big enough to be about a state, we have 1 million students, why can't we apply directly for a program that otherwise only serves states? So they came together. As you can see, that there are 6.3 million students in California, 1 million of them in this group, about 2/3 of those from Los Angeles, but there are several other significant sized cities. And they came together and applied for a federal waiver that's been offered where individual districts, or in this case a constellation of individual states, or in this case a constellation of districts, can actually get a relief on the standard federal approach to how you have to track how schools are doing since you're getting federal money, and instead offer a different approach to accountability, which is different in both what they're measuring and also how they're enforcing what happens in accountability. So the key here is that whereas every other federally licensed system in the United States for measuring how students are doing in schools pretty much is all about academics, generally all about test scores, maybe about graduation rates. They broke out and said, we want 60% to be academics, but 40% we want to weigh the social emotional characteristics of the students and the culture and climate in the school. And that's not the only thing that's different about this waiver, but for the purposes of this call, that's kind of the notable and important thing. Lastly, CORE is thinking about through this school quality improvement system, which is what they call their overall approach. They're doing 2 things that I think are important that impact the work we're doing with them. First, they're the first large-scale education system in the U.S. to say we are going to get to a place where we're routinely measuring across the same numbers of students with the same fidelity rates and so on, some measures of their social emotional competencies, not just their academic skill levels. And second, they have a different approach to accountability inspired by Michael Fullen, where they're focused not on punitive outcomes to low-performing schools, but rather the proper identification of schools that need more help and then the pairing of them with high-performing schools in order to provide kind of coaching and support for improvements rather than consequences. Obviously, one could debate accountability philosophies, but I think it's important here where people have concerns about how reliably we could measure social emotional capacities, and if we're measuring them and then there's immediate significant consequence to people's jobs or funding, is that not a bad environment? It's important to note that although it's quote-unquote accountability, in this setting, there's probably less than normally is associated with accountability of kind of incentives for people to be angry about it, to mislead it, to do other such things. I'm going to now turn it over to my colleague Sara Barlino, who not only is the co-founder of this, but really leads all of our real work with CORE to lead you through that project and what we've learned so far.
Thanks, Chris. So to talk a little bit further about CORE's approach to the social emotional or non-cognitive, and we use those terms interchangeably, to that portion of their new school quality improvement system, I wanted to highlight this three-pillar approach that the superintendents of the core districts have collectively embraced in terms of how they will address student social emotional competencies. So the first pillar is really deciding on or identifying a set of common measures that are valid and reliable and are also, of course, feasible to be used in schools across these multiple districts. That's really the linchpin here and something that we've had to do a lot of deep work around that is still very much underway. The second pillar, of course, is figuring out how to engage educators in this work to help them understand the importance of these competencies, to help them understand how to make use of the data, and how to really inform their instruction accordingly. And the third piece is explicit student supports, whether that's existing instructional practices or specific standalone interventions that can be used to help students develop these competencies throughout their time in school. So today I want to talk a little bit more about Pillar 1, the common measures piece in particular. CORE's work on this first pillar, the common measures piece, has really, it's rolling out in three pieces. Last school year, 2013-14, we piloted with about 9,000 students a set of social emotional measures and the early stages of an educator engagement strategy. So that was that second pillar. And going forward this year, 2014-15, we'll be testing a refined set of measures with several hundred thousand students, I should say. And next year, 2015-16, we'll be implementing this set of measures with all 1 million students across the 7 core districts. So I want to share a little bit more about what we, how that pilot was structured, how CORE is approaching these measures, and the results that we actually saw in last year's pilot, since the field test this year has not yet begun. So to start, I want to highlight the 4 specific competencies that core districts have prioritized for their initial work together. This is by no means a comprehensive set. They're not claiming that this is, the full set of social emotional competencies that students need to succeed, but this list was arrived at through a combination of looking at the research to date to see what competencies had the most robust research base, and through talking to educators about which competencies were most important to them in their own felt experience and observation of classroom practice. So they arrived at this set of 4: growth mindset, which is really the belief that one's abilities or intelligence can grow with effort; self-efficacy, which is closely related to students' self-confidence or their belief in their ability to succeed; self-management, which is often talked about as self-control, closely related to a lot of the executive functions; and finally, social awareness, which is really the ability to take the perspective of, empathize, and interact effectively with others. So having prioritized this set of competencies, CORE decided to embark on a measures test that looked at both student self-report and teacher report measures where applicable. So we actually looked at, for students in grades K to 4, for the youngest students, because they're typically too young to reflect accurately on their own competencies, we only use teacher report for those students. In the higher grades, grades 5 to 12, so that's our sort of middle and high school level, we had students self-report on their own growth mindset, self-efficacy, self-management, and social awareness. And we also had teachers report on 2 of those 4 competencies, the 2 that are believed to be more externally observable. And as you'll see in the right-hand column on key partners, we've essentially curated a set of measurements that have come from the top researchers in the field and drawn those together in a collective set that could be used feasibly across a large number of schools. I'm going to do a quick recap of the high-level findings of our pilot here, and just note that there are some graphs and charts on the following slides that will actually dig into this further. But at the highest level, we were quite pleased with the results of the pilot last year. As I said, we administered these measures to about 9,000 students and 1,000 teachers across 6 of the core districts. What we found was that all 4 competencies that CORE had prioritized were significantly correlated with GPA, students' grades, and with their standardized test scores in both math and ELA or English. So what we're understanding from that is that all 4 of these competencies are positively related to the student outcomes that we care about. In addition to that, we noticed in terms of comparing the teacher report with the student report, we noticed that the teacher reports on students' competencies were more highly correlated with the external variables. So again, those test scores, grades, absences, suspensions, etc., than students' own self-reports were. So the correlations between kids' self-reports and the teacher reports were relatively low, about 0.08 to 0.33, which tells us that we're actually getting different information from students on their self-reports than we are from teachers on their reports on students. We hope that those two sources may be complementary, but we're doing some further exploration to see if one is so much better than the other that you actually really only need one as opposed to both. The other thing I'll share just briefly is that the correlations between multiple teachers' ratings of a given student were quite high. They were generally above 0.5, which tells us that on average, the teachers really share a similar understanding of what these student competencies are, and that they share a similar understanding of how a student demonstrates those competencies across different classes. So to dig in briefly to some of the findings here more quantitatively, I wanted to share the correlations that we found between the self-management ratings, these are the student self-reports, with some of the external variables that we're interested in. So in the first and second columns here, you see GPA. The first column is the middle school grades, and the second is the high school grades. In both cases, we saw correlations between 0.3 and 0.4 with students' self-reported self-management and those grades. The two different shades of blue here just represent two different forms of the assessment that we administered to see if there were differential responses or to see if one turned out to be more reliable and valid than another. So in this case, we actually found that the darker blue, one form of the self-management assessment seemed to perform a little bit better, and we've now decided to use that one as opposed to the form B going forward. In the third and fourth columns, you see the correlations between these self-management student ratings and these are test scores, so standardized tests in both math and English language arts. So those are slightly lower than the correlation with grades, as we might expect, given that the working hypothesis here is that grades tend to capture both students' intellectual or academic abilities and some of their non-cognitive competencies, whereas standardized test scores tend to capture more of their academic abilities and less of the non-cog piece. So those correlations are in line with what we expect. You'll see on the right side of the page some inverse correlations with suspensions and absences. Again, this is as we'd suspect in the sense that if students have high levels of self-management, they tend to be suspended and they tend to be absent less frequently. So all of these are very much in line with what we'd expect and has led us to be more confident in the measures that we've been using. The next few slides just replicate those same analyses for three different other competencies. So I'm just going to tick through them quickly. Social awareness, we saw quite similar patterns to the self-management. Growth mindset, similar patterns again here, except that we noticed one of the measures that we tested performed quite a bit better than the other. So that's the dark blue again. And finally, the self-efficacy measures. Again, we're seeing the same types of correlations here throughout. Highest correlations with students' grades, slightly lower but still significant correlations with academic test scores, and inverse correlations, as we would expect, with measurements of suspension and expulsion.
Might I make one quick comment?
Sure.
Sarah, it's important to note the goal of developing these measures is not to, in fact, predict these outcomes. These were just very satisfying to us early signs that we would have expected these kinds of correlations, in addition to helping us choose between Form A and Form B, give us some confidence that at a reasonably large scale, in a reasonably uncontrolled environment with regard to how the test administration went on, that we are receiving, statistically significant, potentially quite useful information. The absences and suspensions would come closer to some of the core issues that CORE wants to address through these, rather than just another way of showing academic. Yeah. So
absolutely.
We want to be clear that our goal isn't to predict those, we're using those to validate.
It's a way of validating. And in addition to that, we looked at a few other forms of reliability and validity measures on these specific survey-based approaches that we tested. So this is just a measure of internal reliability within any given scale. Typically, folks use the 0.7 benchmark as an acceptable level here. So we were quite pleased with the performance of all of those scales. This slide addressed a more complex issue, which is really this notion of reference bias. And some of you may be deeply familiar with this. Essentially, the idea that individual students' perceptions of what it means to have high self-management or growth mindset or any particular competency may vary significantly depending on the background of that student, the peer set that they're surrounded by, the school environment that they're in, and so on. And that's really a deep problem with self-report measures that we and many others are grappling with. Now, our partners at ETS have developed an approach called anchoring vignettes that is meant to mitigate this issue. We tested that out in last year's pilot with the core districts, and unfortunately we found that in this particular case, when we tested them, the effect of the anchoring vignettes was not what we had hoped. So it did not actually mitigate this issue that students may come into the survey sitting with different perceptions of what it means to have high self-management, for example. So we're very committed to exploring other approaches to mitigating that issue and to dealing with the other issues that arise when you use survey-based measures of student competencies.
And we'll continue to look at that, just to be clear. As you can see, since the anchoring vignette approach in each case lowered the correlation, there isn't a suggestion that, in fact, ETS has demonstrated on PISA data that it increases, that it suppresses differences in context, hence our assumption that it did not add value for us in year one.
Absolutely. So I want to skip to, this was just a quick note that, we're doing some deeper exploration on these measures. Last year, again, this was fewer than 10,000 kids. This year we'll be repeating some tests with updated measures with over several 100,000 students. So it's really a much larger scale test to give us a sense of how robust these measures are, how feasible they are to administer at scale and whatnot. Quickly, just to give you a sense of the work that CORE is doing beyond the measurement piece, since that was only the first of the 3 pillars that I mentioned earlier, CORE is quite interested in deepening educators' understanding of these social emotional competencies, so that educator engagement piece, also in developing instructional resources. So in many cases, we've been talking with a lot of educators about how to map from these social emotional competencies to specific state standards or other academic standards that teachers are thinking about on a daily basis. And so we're working with teachers to create instructional resources that will help sort of bridge that gap. And finally, we're looking at ways to evaluate existing interventions that are meant to build student skills on these competencies. So there are a variety of approaches already in use, and one of the great values of having this common set of measures across 1 million students is that it gives us an opportunity to really evaluate the impact of those existing interventions, to see whether or not there are tools already out there that are really helping students improve these skills. So I want to switch over to talk a little bit about broader implications and lessons learned here. The first is really more of a philosophy behind the core approach than a lesson learned, at least at this point. It's really this notion that we manage what we measure. So incorporating measures of these social, emotional, or non-cog skills into a school performance system is important because it gives us a readout on whether students are increasing those skills over time, whether schools are effectively increasing those skills, and only when we have that measurement or that readout are we able to really address this in an ongoing way. Are we able to manage school performance in a way that really prioritizes this as an outcome alongside students' academic outcomes?
Yeah, I just would comment. I mean, these were some. We're going to go through 5 quick thoughts that come to us when we think about this. We're not claiming these are, validated points, and the first one is kind of a philosophy. I think one thing that is important that we're trying to do through the second pillar that we talked about at the beginning is begin to understand just to what degree is that true. And it's a core assumption of this that by measuring these, we will start to see a shift in interest. We certainly saw strong anecdotal interest in the toolkit we developed for principals to be able to explain to teachers why are we doing this at all and what are we actually doing, which we centered on one of the competencies, growth mindset, because we felt it was particularly accessible. The anecdotal feedback was, we were able to shift perhaps the psychology of, God, they're measuring some other thing, I don't even know what it is, to this is sort of interesting because actually this comports with some of what I've seen in classrooms and something I wish to work on. So we don't have hard evidence of that, but there was enthusiasm, so we developed a toolkit for the second of the competencies, which we're going to roll out on a larger basis. Ultimately, this is only worth doing to the degree that this outcome happens.
And again, from that systems change perspective, one of the other things that we've really, we certainly knew coming in, but I guess our belief in the importance of building buy-in at all levels of the system has really been reinforced through this work. As I know, many of you are system leaders, district leaders, et cetera, and this core project that we've partnered on has really been unique in the level of commitment that the superintendents or the district leaders had at the outset of the process. And in many ways, that created a lot of opportunities. It actually created the opportunity for these folks to measure school performance in a different way. But that certainly has not made up for the buy-in that is needed at more of the school level, at the individual teacher level. And so that is really something that we're trying to focus more on going forward, is building buy-in at all levels of the system, not just at that superintendent level.
Yeah, I would add, I mean, I think a couple of things that we've learned as a result include it would be entirely unrealistic to be going faster than we are. The time frames, we could be moving much faster, we ourselves, but the time frames needed for people to socialize the notion of what choices are being made, initially on the competencies and then subsequently on the measures, and then how they're going to be deployed, how teachers will or won't be engaged, and so forth. It's been crucial that it rippled through the systems, that many people at many different levels have an opportunity to express concerns, to make suggestions, for that to be processed. A whole lot of sort of buy-in that has had to be, encountered. And I would add one more point that I think probably goes to a lot of the things that people interested in the work here at CAA are encounter, which is these non-cognitive competencies are something that almost everyone has a personal opinion on. There is a cacophony of different terminology and ideas that overlap amongst them. And so being the first to come around and say, we're going to measure it this one way, really calls the question on all of the, unto now allowed, dissent about what you mean or what I mean, or ambiguities about definitions and so forth. So I think that's probably true for any new, previously less kind of rigorously measured, or at least systematically measured set of competencies. I think that would apply for sort of the deeper learning type of things, or creativity, or many other terms that we're not approaching, but where I suspect similarly, once you start saying to people, well, this is the exact way we're going to operationalize that, you run into a lot of complexities about having people be comfortable taking one standard approach.
And certainly related to that, being on what we sometimes call the bleeding edge of the systems change element of this non-cognitive work, one of the things we find is how difficult it is to really balance what is ideal from the research perspective and then what is feasible in education systems, including the pace of change, including the time that's needed to build buy-in, and so on. So for example, we had talked a lot with CORE at the outset about continuously refining the measures of these competencies that they would use year over year as new research emerged, showing that a certain measure might work better than the previous version, and so on and so forth. So that was very much CORE's approach and assumption going into this work. But what we found in practice is that there's a certain amount of inertia that comes with just having built all the buy-in you need to around one set of measures, for example, or one decision about how to administer, how to approach this work. And rethinking that year over year is actually quite challenging and a huge lift. So there's sort of this constant tension between what is the cutting edge of what we know and what we're learning scientifically, and what is reasonable to actually to do and administer within schools. Do you want to speak to these also?
I think that as we think about the school system, side of this, one thing that we're excited about is that, again, within the bounds certainly of the United States, and I think there's very important work happening elsewhere that's relevant to this, but we are encouraged by the degree to which CORE, by taking this path, has begun to demonstrate to other school systems that regardless of debating, internal reliability measures or specific questionnaire surveys or whatever, that you really could take a different approach to assessment for this. But we don't think, that accountability is in quite this form is the only lever for doing so. And in fact, when we talk about this work with a lot of people, there's a lot of anxiety about mixing, what is seen as kind of two different streams of thinking, what you should be accountable for and what you should learn from. And so we're certainly seeing that in the reaction of a lot of people. At this point in the history of CORE, no one has been actually held accountable. So it's more of the driver that the work is happening at all than it is yet a implemented reality. And as part of that, I think we're excited about what we may learn about how, that what you measure, is what you end up managing. We are hopeful that the sort of formative qualities of beginning to proliferate this information inside these districts will really help people see, especially with a lot of buy-in along the way, the level at which educators may rally to that flag, not because their jobs are at stake or their school will be shut down or even that the accountability system is fully implemented, but simply because they're receiving information they had not received before, and it's sufficiently actionable and worthy that, to use the full term they like, their moral imperative kicks in.
Absolutely. So we'd love to do some Q&A. Greg, do you want to kick us off or talk a little bit about the procedure for Q&A?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Chris and Sarah. And very interesting work you're doing and the scale you're doing and some of the lessons that I learned from that. So what I would like to do is open up for an opportunity for people to ask a question, and there's two ways that you can do that. One is that you can put your hand up and I will nominate you so we don't have two people speaking at once or whatever. There's a little button under the participants to be able to put your hand up. And then you can also type a question into the chat window if you have a question you would like to ask. So we have some questions already, and I'm going to start with a question from Maria Stockhouse in Sweden. And the question is, have you worked on resources for teachers to use to improve these competencies?
Absolutely. So Chris mentioned earlier the, quote, toolkits that we were working on, and just to give a quick description of what those are, they're really essentially a professional development session in a box, by which I mean it's the set of materials that a principal or a school leader might need to walk educators in his or her school through what is this specific competency, why does it matter, what might a teacher begin to do to move the needle on this competency. And it includes in that sort of an animated, typically 5 to 7 minute video that sort of introduces the concept, and then 1 or 2 individual videos that we call student voice videos. So really an opportunity to hear from individual students about why this competency is important in their lives. And so what we've found is that those have been incredibly effective and very scalable tools to help educators introduce this concept or help other teachers dig deeper into this concept in their school. Those are really it's more of a starter kit, if you will. It's more of a way to catalyze the conversation, and there's a lot of deeper professional learning that would need to happen beyond that. But it is something that we found quite effective in starting the conversation.
Great. Thank you. And are you sharing your materials broadly, or are you waiting till they're finalized?
We would be happy to send them around to this group, and we're in the process of getting them up on our website, so we'd be happy to share those. Great.
We will try and do that if people want access to those materials. Another question we have from the chat window. I'm just checking if anyone's put their hand up. No one with hands up. So, in view of your comment on the potential, this is from Matt Wingfield, by the way. In view of your comment on the potential for subjectivity in defining and assessing these competencies, have you ever explored options to move to a more holistic assessment approach that are less rubric-based, e.g. the work being done by Goldsmiths, London University and the University of Limerick into assessing soft skills with high reliability?
Well, first of all, we'd like to learn more about that, so I hope the questioner would be kind enough to send us a particular research they're interested in, or they're intrigued by. I think that generally speaking, I raised the debatability of some of the terminology more in the context of buy-in than necessarily in the rigor with which we think we've selected the specific measures. So if I look at something like growth mindset, one of the reasons we recommended it for board picked it is that's got, I think, amongst the better set of research validations of both its measures and its impact on students. And then back to Maria Stockhaus's question in terms of focused interventions that can change growth mindset. Carol Dweck, but now a number of her sort of disciples from Stanford and at other universities have done, I think, quite an impressive body of literature, even connecting a student's growth mindset to specific behaviors that matter for academic success, such as willingness and ability to revise work or seek support. So we've tried to generally, and I think somewhere in the slides that Sarah put forward, we actually listed in each case what collaborator we counted on. We've tried not to use our own opinion, but to sort of sift through, existing, pretty well validated in the psychological literature measures where they were available and bodies of work. Where we've run into harder issues practically is the fact that just because we say there's a scientific publication doesn't mean that, a teacher, a principal, a district leader sort of buys that some scientist somewhere's opinion of something is, going to bind on them. I think that the separate question of, are these the best way to measure these? I mean, I'm fairly convinced they're not. And in fact, we had the pleasure of meeting you, Greg, through our desires to explore that area more. And I think one of the things Sarah meant by one of the points she brought up is, so far, I would describe us as more frustrated than encouraged at how hard it is. People want to talk about these much more interesting assessment approaches, but then when you get to large-scale implementations, they want to know, can you get it down to 12 minutes, 8 minutes, what's the minimum possible, work? And I'm sure that we're just relearning what many of you know much more, much better than us. So we're very committed to trying to create at core and in other places we're working that are a little more research-oriented, the kind of atmosphere where people would be interested in performance tasks, more authentic measures based on trained observation of teachers or even third parties and so forth. But we've tried to adopt here for this work pretty well validated, although usually in small scale, psychological measures.
Thanks again. Next, hello? Someone want to make a comment or ask a question? No. So this one, this question comes from Pat Killinan from ETS. Did you compare teacher ratings versus self-assessments to see which ones predicted grade, suspension, absences more strongly?
Yes, we did. So we found that the teacher ratings were typically more predictive than the student self-assessments, I believe on every variable.
I should add, we are very grateful to Pat as an excellent colleague over the years to us and counting on you in the future. So yeah, as Sarah said, we were impressed in this data set that so far the teacher assessments look significantly more attractive from the validating data source.
And significantly less attractive to schools in terms of feasibility, I might add, since that has been a serious challenge in terms of implementation. So as you might imagine, all of the districts feel that there are more than enough asks for teachers these days, and that this would be one additional thing on their plates to rate a bunch of students on these competencies in addition to providing grades on all of the typical academic measures. And so it's been quite challenging to build the buy-in needed to really administer those teacher measures at scale, despite the fact that the evidence shows they're quite predictive, perhaps more predictive than student self-reports on a lot of these external variables that we're interested in.
Thanks. I'll open up to Brett Stone, who has a question. Brett.
Hello, it's Jerry McLaughlin, actually. Jerry and Brett and Joanne are all here together from the New South Wales Department of Education and Communities. We're just on the one line. So, look, we've been doing some work in this space as well in the department in New South Wales. On one hand, we're implementing Tell Them From Me surveys that were developed in Canada by Professor Doug Whelm and his team. And on another angle from our work in New South Wales, we're working with the Institute of Positive Psychology and Education at the Australian Catholic University to explore a very similar study to what it looks that you've done to see if we can identify the best items that we used in instruments to identify social and emotional aspects and relate them to academic performance. So we're very interested in the work you're doing. I found it very, very helpful. I just wanted to get an idea of your administration and the size of the instruments. You made a couple of comments about the length. How many items typically and how much time are students doing this, and how are you administering? Are you using online environment, etc.?
Sure, happy to speak to that. We have on the order of 50 items that we've been using. It typically takes students 20 to 30 minutes to complete them, and schools actually had a choice of administering online or on paper. We were slightly surprised to hear that last year in 2013-14 during the smaller scale pilot, many of the schools actually wanted to administer on paper. I think the vast majority, in fact. This year, because all of the California schools, like many other schools around the U.S., have to do online assessments for the new Common Core aligned assessments, many of them are switching over to now use an online survey approach for assessment. So we're still offering both, and I would say the scales are beginning to tip towards online administration.
Thank you.
By the way, we would be, I'm shamelessly happy to use Greg's convening of fellow travelers from around the globe to say we would be eager to learn more about what you're learning there, because, you know, we perceive relatively few places where people are hybridizing with the academic psychological community. We're lucky to have a number of those people as advisors, you know, are learning to the practicalities of the school environments and the outcomes of interest in the education field. So we would love to learn more about what you're learning. And we're also shameless about not trying to be original, but steal from the best.
Well, that's one of our purposes. We want people to share and to learn from each other. And I know there's a lot of people in this meeting who are working in this domain. So two more questions, one from Radovan. Will the results of the social emotional assessment be part of the final grade of the students? Are the SE competencies part of the curriculum?
Can you repeat the second half of that question, Greg?
Part of the curriculum.
Are the social emotional competencies part of the curriculum?
Yeah, so on the first half, these competency ratings are not intended to be part of students' grades at this point. So the system that Chris was describing at the outset is really a system for looking at school-level performance. So they're sort of tracked at that level, but they're not being used to give ratings of teacher performance, nor of students' own grades or academic performance in any way. In terms of whether they're built in, these competencies are built into the curriculum, I would say the answer to that varies widely across districts and even individual schools and perhaps classrooms. So what we've found in talking to teachers across the core districts is that there's a very wide array of existing curricula, standalone programs, after-school programs, and also instructional strategies as part of academic courses that are all intended to advance these particular competencies. Those various strategies, programs, and approaches have not been particularly aligned to a holistic approach in the past, and I think part of the work ahead of in the years ahead for CORE is to really sort of rationalize what approaches are being used, and do we have evidence now that we have some common measures that those existing approaches are effective. And then the second step there would, of course, be to share the most effective practices across these districts and with other districts worldwide that are interested in advancing these competencies. So short answer is yes, they are currently built into the curriculum in various ways, and we're trying to figure out through these common measures which of those ways are most effective.
Another question from Stephanie Fisher. How are items scored and how reliable is the scoring?
So the scoring, the vast bulk of the first year's data was collected on the proper term for filling in the bubbles with a number 2 pencil.
Oh, paper pencil administration?
Yeah, whatever the right term is, and scored by a partner organization that does a lot of large-scale survey scoring. So They have, published data on what the reliability in terms of just the specific, error rate of those are, but I believe it's exceedingly low. So we think the reliability in terms of the transference from the student's mind and pencil to the results we're getting is, very high, and obviously will be higher, we hope, when we go to more online administration on a broad basis. We offered online this year and had some takers, and as Sarah said, we expect a lot more next year and in the future. Is that responsive to the question?
I think so. One more question, and then we may wrap up.
Just to be clear, these surveys were we've seen some of the work, Greg, that you and others are doing, and we are, have enormous desire to go into much more sophisticated approaches, including things like, in particular, some of the collaborative problem-solving work. I think is, where it's almost a must-be. These approaches were surveys with typically 6 or so items, 6 questions perhaps, or 8 questions per competency, where they were generally on a 1 to 5, 1 to 7 classic scale, with a lot of energy put, and even some politics about whether you got to put the nicest term first, or there was some negotiation on terminology that had nothing to do with science, but they were just collecting students' agreement or disagreement in general with a affirmative sentence. I'm someone who believes intelligence is your intelligence is fixed, and you can strongly agree to strongly disagree, as an example.
Probably last question. Brett Stone, or our group from Australia, what sorts of student support do you have in the third pillar?
Sure, happy to speak to this. It sort of goes back to the question about, is this built into the existing curriculum? So there's a wide variety of ways that teachers are currently supporting students on this front, and part of what we're trying to do is understand what those are, which ones are working, and how can we share best practices across the network of schools and districts that are part of this effort. So that's sort of the current approach, and in addition to that, certainly through some of our partners, we're hearing more about a variety of other approaches, sort of standalone interventions and whatnot, that have been shown to be quite effective with students around the world. And we're interested in helping CORE begin to pilot or implement some of those effective interventions within the CORE districts.
Yeah, so just to be clear, that third pillar is a framework that we presented to the CORE board and had them buy into, because we were concerned that although the task at hand of urgency to them was the measures, that we did not think it could be effective if they didn't look at this holistically. We were certainly glad that they bought into the engagement. We've had a lot of good success with that. We are offering nothing ourselves right now with regard to the interventions, which we see as, or teacher supports for, day-to-day practice. Obviously, that's ultimately the only reason to be really, or a primary driver for interest. But it's not in the scope of the initial work. What's groundbreaking here is the approach to try to standardize and broadly measure these competencies. I think one thing that Sarah's also brought out, though, which goes to like learning from time in the field, and I would think this would apply to a lot of other things, is we're working on our policy side on a paper to demonstrate to people just how widespread but chaotic the current level of practice is. So there's one survey, for example, that shows that 88% of teachers in the United States say they're doing something now to raise these competencies broadly defined. What is it? Who told them it was a good idea? How do they know if it's working? How well are they doing it? Nobody knows. It's quite certain that many of them are, inconsistent with what's happening in the classroom next door, maybe even antithetical to what's happening in the classroom next door. And much of it is, I think, been, when you look at the websites of the organizations promoting many of these things, there's thin evidence, really, that they're effective. Some of them have stronger evidence. I'm not trying to run the whole field down, but I'm just saying there's a lot of solutions right now, and there's a lot of teachers who really believe and educators that they should be doing something, and they're not waiting for standards, measures, or anything else. So we actually think that developmentally, the key next step is going to be less to be prescriptive about what people ought to do, but in fact to enable a better kind of evaluative sort of processes so that people can realize that some things are that they think are working probably aren't, and some things they're doing may be working really well, and to use that, kind of naturalistic process to surface approaches they might adopt. So we're certainly hoping the core districts become a hotbed for the most innovative interventions and for new ones, but we suspect that it'll be more important to help people get their arms around what they're already doing before we try to argue that they should do something different.
Thank you, Chris and Sarah. And what I would like to do is just say that we will follow up with information. If you do have something you want to share, and you can email myself or one of our team here. I should have my email address on here somewhere, I think. There. So, or you can contact us through our website. Then we will share a link to the recording of the thing. We'll send you a follow-up email with a link to more information. Plus, we'll work with Chris and the team to get access to the resources we said we'd share. And if you do have anything, please just share us. So thanks again, all of you, for participating in this Collaborative Assessment Alliance webinar. And Chris and Sarah, would you mind if we shared your email addresses with people so that if they want to contact you directly, they can?
Absolutely.
That sounds great.
We are Chris and Sarah, she has no H, S-A-R-A, at transformingeducation.org.
Okay.
And we'd be happy to share those toolkits as well, so I'll send the links for those to you, Greg.
And Greg, thank you. I did a chance, I think there are probably others on the phone besides Pat Killinan, but who have been directly active, colleagues and friends. But you too, Greg, thank you very much for being such a pioneer in this, and thank you for educating us. We have some things we do well, and there's some things we know very little about, and we've learned a lot of what we already know about this approach that you and others have brought forward through the time you patiently spent with us. So we're really appreciative that you're willing to take people low on the competence bar or anywhere on the competency bar, which is a good SEL attitude to have.
Thank you very much. And thanks, everyone. Take care. Have a good rest of your day.
Bye-bye.